in his 60s who was found dead in Limerick City over the weekend. The 69-year-old, who's believed to be from Poland originally, had been sleeping rough in the city centre and was found in a laneway off Little Catherine Street early on Friday morning. It's understood the man may have been offered accommodation and had made attempts to access homeless services as early as last week. Beds in homeless shelters were available the night before and all through January, according to Limerick City and County Council. Live95 Sarah Coleman has been speaking to Una Burns from Novas, who started by offering her condolences to the family.
Absolutely, Sarah. It's really tragic, and first of all, I'd like to pay our deepest condolences to the man's family and friends. It's such a tragic way for somebody to pass and such difficult news for a family to hear this weekend. So we're deeply saddened by this man's death.
And it was believed that this man was known to homeless services, so was somebody who was living on the streets for quite some time.
I believe that the man was known to homeless services, and I think he had engaged in the past with homeless services. And the extent of his rough sleeping, I'm not aware of. But I suppose it highlights the vulnerability of homeless people who sleep in the streets, particularly at winter time when the temperatures are very, very cold. I suppose homeless people who are rough sleeping are, one of the most vulnerable people in our society at this time.
I just want to go back to a point you made there about the cold weather. We have had one of the coldest winters and some record low temperatures as low as -8 this month. Nobody can or should be expected to survive in those conditions. To be homeless at any stage, at any time of the year, is unacceptable. But in minus freezing conditions, I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds that really hard to comprehend.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult at this time of the year for somebody who's rough sleeping. And as you say, January has been an exceptionally cold month. My understanding is that the man had been offered accommodation. COVID poses significant challenges in terms of our ability and the council's ability, or any homeless provider's ability, to provide additional winter beds like we normally would, because of social distancing, because of ensuring that services remain safe, remain COVID free, and that we have the requisite space between clients and that we're not exceeding that. So I suppose it's a challenging time of the year anyway for homeless providers and for local authorities in meeting the needs of homeless people. But this year, I suppose we have an added difficulty in terms of meeting the needs of people and around COVID and around infection control measures, and also meeting the needs of people who may not have access to temporary or emergency accommodation.
Okay, so the pandemic has amplified the homeless crisis for sure and has limited access to resources, but it's still a long-standing societal issue that has been here well before the pandemic ever hit our shores, not just here in Limerick, but the rest of the country as well. What resources in Limerick are currently still available now in the way of groups out on the street who might assist those in need, shelters, beds, that sort of thing? What's the current situation in Limerick at the moment?
The COVID-19 has had a profound impact on people who are homeless throughout the pandemic, largely through isolation. Many of the services, the ancillary services that they access, it had to be paused or had to be done over the phone. Of course, all accommodation services stayed open right throughout the pandemic. That's the largest challenge that homeless people faced during the pandemic. In terms of services, they have continued. Street services have continued, residential services have continued, and in many respects more space has been made available in homeless services, and people might have had an opportunity to have single rooms and stuff which they didn't have before. So there has been some positives for the homeless community, and particularly for homeless families, who there has been a significant reduction of homeless families living in B&Bs right throughout the country who have now access to accommodation. But certainly there has been significant negative experiences for homeless people whose group and whose interactions and connections are very small anyway, and they have diminished more because of COVID, and we need long-term solutions through housing, particularly small units of housing for single individuals who have definitely suffered the most during the pandemic.
That's Una Burns from Novus in Limerick chatting to our own Sarah. And Sarah Beasley is Aintu, the party's National Executive Secretary based here in Limerick, and she's on the line. Good morning to you, Sarah.
Good morning, Joe. And yes, I'd like to also offer condolences to the family of this gentleman that unfortunately died during last week.
Now, you knew him.
I did. Into Limerick, we set out an initiative. We set up a team to go onto the streets to see how the homeless were coping and why they were out there. And it's a very, very complex issue. And in fact, only on that evening, on the Thursday, I had confirmed with the Homeless Action Team that there were beds available because we would be doing head counts. So yes, we know most of the gentlemen and women out there and the young people, there's a mixed bag, Joe.
But how did a 69-year-old, originally from Poland, end up dying on the streets, homeless in Limerick?
Firstly, there's a lack of accommodation for single accommodation. And a lot of these men and women, when you meet them, there's mental health, there is addiction. This gentleman, there was none of that. But it's just so complex. Some of them are frightened to go into the shelters just because, drugs are available and they're out there. I mean, the streets are awash with drugs in Limerick, and that's something that's, is another subject. But unfortunately, some people...
Well, had he come to Limerick to work?
I'm not sure, but there would be a bed available, and I'm sure sometimes they just will not take the beds, and we are trying to work around this issue. Why will they not?
But this reporting that I think it's very important we try and understand this.
Yes.
This reporting that he had contact with homeless services, in the early part of last week. So had he at any stage that week slept inside?
I couldn't tell you that, Joe. But when you meet them, they sometimes will have a little chat with you. Sometimes they won't. But I can assure you that there is beds available, and we only keep on saying, after a certain time, they must ring into the Homeless Action Team emergency number. And I would ring that nearly every evening. There's always someone at the end of the line, and they always will offer a bed.
And this man, I mean, you had chatted to him. How was his English?
Poor, but he could communicate, and he was a lovely gentleman, and he was a pure gentleman. But unfortunately,
and had he no way of making his way home? Had he no contacts in Limerick that would put him in a situation where he wouldn't end up dying on our streets?
Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks and to actually tell the full story. There's a trust issue when people, when you first approach anybody that's homeless, they're wondering who you are, why you're actually going to talk to them. So once it takes a few weeks, like myself and actually Pauline Casey, whose sister Louise died on the street, we're out most nights as an A2 team because it's something very close to the Casey's heart that their, daughter and sister died on the streets in 2016, and it's something we didn't want to see again.
Right. Well, Sarah, I want to chat to you a little bit more about this because, it's such a tragedy that this man, so many thousands of kilometres from his original home, ends up dying on a Limerick street. We're talking to Sarah Beasley from Aintu. She's the National Executive Secretary, and she had come across this man who was originally from Poland. We'll talk a little bit more after a short break. Yeah, we're chatting to Sarah Beasley, who is Aintu's National Executive Secretary based here in Limerick. She would have come across this unfortunate man, originally from Poland, who was discovered dead at Limerick Lane off Catherine Street around 8 a.m. on Friday morning. What about trying to trace this man's family? What's going to happen to his remains?
Well, at the moment, from what I can see, obviously he was taken away to the university hospital, but that would be something we would love to be able to do just to actually make sure that he has, I suppose, a dignified and fitting send-off. It's just the most strange times in COVID, and
But I mean, we obviously have a significant Polish population here in Limerick. I know we have official connections to Poland and the Polish government here in Limerick, and through Dublin as well in their embassy. I mean, is there any way of ensuring that this man, if necessary, is repatriated?
Well, I think there's actually people talking about that in Limerick at the moment, because I can see that on social media, that's the one thing. We can't take away what's happened, but let's make sure that Limerick sends him hopefully home in a dignified fashion, Joe. As I say, it's tragic, and I look.
It really is. I mean, you said yourself in your statement, you know, he was 69, and you said, you know, you thought of your own family circumstances, and, you know, we all obviously have older relatives.
Well, it's like I say, you would hate to think of your father on the street, and you see single men are suffering. If there's a breakdown in a family relationship and the man leaves the family home, where do they go if they don't work? Or even if they do work, where do they get accommodation at the moment in the city? So we're seeing a lot of that when we're talking to people.
Which by accommodation, you mean more general accommodation rather than the homeless emergency accommodation?
Exactly. But sometimes that's where they actually do end up. And when you see somebody that's actually, some men are working in, you know, the hostels, but they cannot afford accommodation on their own because they're still supporting their families at home. And women as well. You know, we have lovely ladies that we meet on the street. And again, young girls that sometimes in this pandemic are not getting on in the family home, and they're going onto the street. And it's the most complex situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the great work being done by organisations like Novus and Midwest Simon. And indeed, if people feel moved to help this morning, well, that's how you can do that. You can go online to the Novus website or the Midwest Simon website, or other charities that do fantastic work here in Limerick, and maybe contribute a little or in some way. And they always warn me when we're talking about this in more general terms, you know, it's not simple. There are complex issues, but at the same time, when we end up in a situation towards the end of January, with everything else we're going through, to see a man dying overnight in the streets, it's just awful.
I think everybody really got a shock, and I think it's the age group as well. You know, it's someone's, like, could it be someone's granddad?
Yeah.
And they're the questions we have to ask, and hopefully we could put something together for Limerick City and make sure this gentleman does get home.
All right. Well, look, may he rest in peace. Thank you very much for telling us about your own interaction with him in the past as well, and for your general observations this morning. That's Sarah Beasley, who is the Aim 2 Party's National Executive Secretary.